They were spoken of in the same breath as storms and plagues, as if they were not men but a climate. Merchants lowered their voices when the name drifted across a table. Governors felt their palms grow cold when a whisper said the emperor had taken notice. Children on stations saw a patrol of gray uniforms slide past and learned, without being taught, that there are forces in the universe you do not obstruct. The Sardaukars were not merely soldiers. They were a myth given boots and blades, a shadow that fell before any proclamation, a verdict declared in the language of fear. Long before a banner was raised or a treaty sealed, the sound of their march ended negotiations. Even their silence meant policy. You feared the emperor, but you obeyed the Sardaukar. To understand why the Imperium bent to them, begin where they were tempered, not in parade grounds or academies with polished floors, but on a world that punished every weakness. Salusa Secundus was the imperial prison and the emperor's anvil. It did not educate. It culled. The sky could turn from steel to fire without warning. The ground was a teacher that repeated only one lesson: survive or be replaced by one who will. On that planet of ashen winds, of poisonous nights and air that scraped the lungs, the Sardaukar were born. The environment was their first drill master. Hunger disciplined them. Radiation carved away the careless. Sand and rock, heat and cold, predators and contagion. These were the authors of their creed, long before an officer ever spoke to them. A boy or girl who lived long enough to be noticed did not enter a school so much as an order. They learned to move in the open, as if already indoors, to make cover from angles, to read the weather like a command. They learned that speech is a resource, to be rationed. They learned that a blade is not a weapon until it has already found its mark, and that a gun is a voice only when it speaks at exactly the right moment. Training on Salusa Secundus was never finished. It was a season that never ended. The young learned to sleep while footsteps passed nearby and to wake without a start. They were taught to fight against shields and without them, to time the slow thrust that defeats field technology, to break balance with the smallest pressure, to disappear in scarred terrain that offered almost no concealment. Every movement had a reason. Every reason served the emperor. This contact, their conditioning went deeper than muscle. The mind, too, was stripped and hardened. Isolation was not a temporary test. It was a climate of thought. Instructors did not shout. They asked questions that had only one acceptable conclusion. Loyalty was defined as geometry. A Sardaukar could trace its angles at any hour. The chain of command was not a chart. It was a creed. To betray it would be to fall out of the world. From childhood, they rehearsed obedience as others rehearse songs. The words were few. Obey the standard. Shield the mission. Break the enemy's will. Protect the throne. Beneath these lines lay the subtext that made them terrifying. Mercy is an option only when victory is secure. Doubt is venom. Hesitation is a confession. If pity rises, kill it first. Where cultures build identity through festivals and monuments, the Sardaukar built identity through ordeal. They kept rites, but theirs were the ritual of endurance. Each cohort had its scars and its sayings. Tales of marches across ground that would cook the feet, of nights where a unit lay flat as ash, while the wind howled like a choked engine. They named their dead not as a lament, but as a ledger of debt. The living owed the fallen a victory tallied in fear. There were oaths spoken before dawn, when the light made every face a gray mask. There were silent meals that communicated more than speeches. They honored the blade by polishing it together, not as ornament, but as a mirror that asked a single question: are you still the weapon your emperor expects? Thank you for watching For the Save. Even their appearance carried policy. The uniform was not made to impress salons. It was made to disappear into bad weather. A drab field gray that could drink dust and ash. A cut that did not snag on broken rock. Armor plates that offered protection without the arrogance of shine. Gloves and visors designed for a world that stung the eyes and split the knuckles. Where other houses painted emblems as if they were charms, the Sardaukar wore the imperial sign with the restraint of a signature on a death warrant. Understated marks of the Lion of Corrino were placed where they could be seen at the last instant, when seeing them mattered most. Their knives were balanced for close quarters and the slow blade art. Their short swords were not ceremonial. Their firearms were chosen for reliability in storms and tight corridors. They carried tools that could breach, bind, and vanish. If a particular device could imprint memory with fear, it was adopted not for spectacle, but for efficiency. The look of a Sardaukar patrol in the doorway of a governor's residence made scribes forget how to breathe. The uniform was an argument, and it always won. The symbol extended beyond cloth. The Sardaukar voice was measured, almost gentle, the way a cliff face is gentle when it declines to fall. They spoke little and never hurried. They did not need to. The rumor of them ran ahead. Their ships did not arrive with fanfare. They arrived with the kind of quiet that empties streets. A single detachment, posted at a spaceport, meant that the Emperor was counting people as if they were coins. A full regiment meant the Emperor was counting graves. This was how a uniform became law. In the Imperium, many charters competed. Many conventions were contested. But the gray was never argued with, and Greet made indifferent to access. With Reinhard and from the blade them side, every empire has need of a blade. The Padishah Emperor held a scepter in one hand and the Sardaukar in the other. In councils where treaties were weighed, the shadow of Salusa Secundus lengthened across the table. The Landsraad bargained and blustered, invoking ancient rites and recent debts. The Spacing Guild navigated and threatened and priced its neutrality. Yet when the Emperor desired an outcome, he did not address the debate. He adjusted the garrison on a vital world. He placed a cohort aboard a highliner, bound for a house, with a loud voice. He allowed an inspection to discover what it was meant to discover. The Sardaukar were not only the mailed fist, they were the unblinking eye. They fulfilled many roles and made them all feel like one. Shock troops who learned to break fortified positions without the comfort of weighty artillery. Commandos who could infiltrate a palace and end a dynasty before breakfast. Military police who set the tone for a planet within a day of landing. Instructors who trained allied units to an edge they could never quite match. Executioners who could carry out a sentence without making a martyr. At moments when the Emperor required discretion, they wore another house's colors, turning a political operation into a domestic quarrel. When the Emperor desired theater, they arrived in full imperial markings, and the theater never needed a second act. With them, the throne could alter the temperature of history. And for here's the rebected or great in of demonsting demonsix fens. The Sardaukar did not spring from the void. History had seen such soldiers before, though none so perfectly fused to a single will. The Empire's historians like to compare them to the ancient Praetorians in their original ideal form, guardians who existed to embody the palace. Others pointed to the Janissaries, taken young, forged in a discipline that made loyalty a place rather than a choice. Strategists spoke of steppe armies that could ride through winter and be more alive at sunset than dawn. Philosophers evoked Spartan valleys, where boys learned to sleep with one eye open and to call endurance a virtue that needed no argument. These analogies were maps that could be drawn for students. The Sardaukar themselves did not need them. They looked upon these echoes of the past with professional interest and then returned to their own work, which was to ensure that comparisons remained academic. Daily life inside the core resembled a monastery that had learned to love steel. Dawn was not a time. It was a standard of alertness. Meals were calibrated to keep the body as spare as a command. Instruction refined what the planet had begun. Drills ran from shield work to blade control, from vacuum maneuvers to close quarters in halls, where a misstep meant a bruise that would last for days. Language training was woven through it all, because orders must be understood under stress, and captured enemies must be understood without being asked twice. The young learned to clean their weapons as if they were washing their hands. They learned to map a building by the way the air moved through it. They studied the politics of fear, not to declaim on it, but to practice it. A Sardaukar did not raise his voice. He adjusted the situation until silence and compliance were the same thing. They entertained only one luxury and called it by another name. They kept their stories. A cohort had a memory of its own. It recalled raids on pirate dens that had grown fat on the margins of spice. It remembered the quelling of a noble's ambition on a minor world that had believed distance to be a defense. It told, in a few stripped sentences, of nights when the stars were sanded out by dust, and the only light was the press of enemy breath in a stairwell. In those stories lay the rhythms that bound them. A commander knew when to let a squad tell one of those memories. The telling reloaded the soul. That's something $2. Their campaigns bent maps. When the emperor required an example, he chose a victim whose fall would be noticed. The Sardaukar made certain the fall was not merely seen, but felt. They did not level cities without need. They changed their posture until the city bowed. A curfew imposed at dusk without prior notice. A supply chain arrested at a choke point. A clan elder invited to a meeting and returned home with a new understanding of what a boundary island. A garrison quietly reinforced, just as a hot-headed noble tested the air with his forces. When open war came, the Sardaukar did not waste motion. They used technology with a craftsman's disdain for gizmos and a killer's respect for tools. Against shields, they moved in slow measure and sudden breaks. Against shieldless foes, they moved like weather, in gusts and lulls that emptied resistance. Terror was not their goal, but they never neglected its use. Rumor was a weapon, and they sharpened it. They allowed a messenger to escape with an intact tongue and a collapsing courage. They permitted a captured officer to live long enough to talk too much in a back room. They staged nothing. They simply allowed witnesses to assemble their own nightmare from facts that did not need help. In the Imperium, news traveled in advance of ships. The Sardaukar understood that what people expect collapses them before the first order is shouted. Everything seemed inevitable until they met a force whose inevitability had been forged in a place even harsher than Salusa Secundus. On Arrakis, the Emperor's blade struck an edge it had not anticipated. The Fremen did not present themselves in rows. They did not hold ground as if ground mattered. They were children of a desert that did not forgive wasted water or wasted time. In them, scarcity had not merely toughened the body, it had made constraint into art. They fought under a religious fire that transmuted fear into function. They moved through sand as if it were memory, appearing where maps insisted there was nothing to hold. When the Emperor joined his interests to the vendetta of House Harkonnen, Sardaukar troopers moved under another banner, so that a political choice could masquerade as private revenge. They expected to face Atreides' honor, Atreides' skill, Atreides' discipline, and they did. They also expected victory. The reputation of Salusa Secundus had challenged every house and never found a teacher. On Arrakis they found an education. The Fremen did not contest the Sardaukar's art of the slow blade. They absorbed it and then slipped past it with a speed that made the distinction meaningless. They did not defend cities behind walls the Emperor could count. They rode storms, struck supply lines, vanished into sands that swallowed whole companies and left behind only a rumor of blue-on-blue eyes and a cry that seeded terror in anyone who heard it. The desert itself punished any miscalculation. Confidence learned humility. Valor learned that there is a difference between survival and belonging. When the Fremen tide surged upon the Imperial positions, when the shield wall fell to a tactic the Great Convention had never imagined in this context, when the sky itself became a weapon and the ground rose, the Sardaukar did not collapse. They did the thing they had been made to do. They fought. They fought in stairwells and on broken battlements. They fought in halls where sand sizzled against force fields. They fought in courtyards while the wind wrote new alphabets in dust. They showed the universe that courage was not proprietary. It was simply not enough. For once, the myth confronted a mirror that did not blink. A people shaped by a harsher school broke the blade of the emperor. The Sardaukars, the unmaking of a legend does not occur in 1 hour or with one defeat. Yet every legend has a first crack, and the fall of Imperial certainty on Arrakis was the sound of that fracture beginning. The name Sardaukar no longer guaranteed the outcome of a negotiation. Governors who had hidden their anxieties behind the gray learned to calculate again. House leaders who had once accepted a quiet visit as the end of a question found that questions could be asked even after the visit. The emperor's reliance on one tool had been a masterpiece and a mistake. He had created soldiers too pure for politics and then used them like pawns inside politics. Over time, that corrodes excellence. Ritual, when it stops being a distillation of necessity and becomes an idol, loses edge. The Sardaukar had never fallen into pomp, but the throne around them had. In the dust of Arrakis, the bill for that complacency came due. After the rise of a new ruler, the empire smelled different. The Fremen spread across the stars like a wind that cleans and scours, and for a long season, they were the fear that governors whispered about. The surviving Sardaukar became a memory with teeth. Some died to preserve an ideal they refused to abandon. Some went to ground with a stubborn, almost holy loyalty to a house that had lost its sky. Some sold their skill and found that it tasted of ash when it did not serve the Lion standard. A few became instructors who preserved a craft because the craft was worth more than any flag. Their world remained a prison and a forge. Their stories continued, but the tone had changed. Once, every tale ended with the same certainty. Now, they ended with a lesson. Historians love lessons. They point to Salusa Secundus and say that environment is the first general. They point to the training halls and say that discipline is currency. They point to the gray uniform and say that symbols are policy. They point to the emperor's councils and say that secrecy is a form of speech. And finally, they point to Arrakis and say that any force which claims invincibility has mistaken reputation for reality. The Sardaukar remain the gold standard of what a throne can build when it is willing to pay in blood and secrecy and patience. They also remain the caution. A blade that never changes cut the world to fit itself, until it found a world it could not shape. Its preacher that inly centers his kludge. From ID, there is a quiet way to read their legacy. Close your eyes and listen to how their name is used. Commanders still speak of making a unit Sardaukar hard, not as flattery but as an objective. Politicians still conjure them when they hint at consequences. Smugglers still tell stories of a single pair of gray gloves left on a desk as a warning. In language, permanence survives defeat. Yet the deeper legacy is harder and less flattering. Power built upon terror can hold an empire still, but it cannot make it alive. Fear compresses, it does not create. The Sardaukar were the ultimate compressive force. They held the Imperium in a grip so firm that, one day, something brittle inside it shattered. What remains admirable is not their aura, but their craft, the slow patience of their footwork, the care with which they observed a street and saw not faces but lines of fire, lines of retreat, lines of thought, the way they guarded one another without speaking. The unshowy competence that made extravagance look foolish. The courage to stand in a corridor that was rapidly becoming a ruin and fulfill a purpose already doomed. These qualities do not belong to any one house. They belong to people who give themselves to a work larger than comfort. In that sense, the Sardaukar are not gone. They are present wherever a soldier bows to necessity and rises with clarity. But myths ask for more than craft. They ask for inevitability. And inevitability is the one thing the Sardaukar can no longer sell. A name that once proceeded like a marching drum now arrives with a footnote. On a certain desert world, the blade was met and broken. The universe learned that even the emperor's shadow had a horizon. Future rulers have taken that to heart. They build new guards and careful schools. They attempt to mix loyalty with flexibility, hardness with humility. They speak of balance as if it were a technology. They try to avoid the trap that closed upon the lion. Whether they succeed is another tale. Stand again at the beginning and listen. You can hear the hush that falls when the old stories begin. In those stories, a ship slides into orbit without fanfare. The air cools in the governor's hall. In a doorway, a line of gray steps through, and every conversation ends. The Sardaukar have arrived. This image still has power, but now there is another chapter, and it lives in the same breath. The desert rose and answered, "Two truths stand beside each other. An empire can make monsters that are also monks, and the world can make an answer to them that is not a copy, but a correction." So the legend closes, as all honest legends must, with admiration beside warning. The Sardaukar were the emperor's deadliest legion, born on a world that taught them to scorn softness, honed by a creed that made obedience a geometry, clad in symbols that turned silence into law. They preserved a throne through fear so potent that it felt like weather. They were broken by a people whose landscape was harsher and whose faith burned hotter. The echo of their march still trembles in halls of power, not as an order but as a question. What kind of strength do you seek? What price will you pay for it? And when the bill comes due, who will you become?